In this lecture, we're going to examine the judiciary and some of the issues in the criminal justice system. Now, obviously, we know a lot about the criminal justice system and some of the players in the criminal justice system. However, we don't know a whole lot about judges. And this is probably because judges don't have the time and are not inclined to participate in experiments or participate in research. So we don't know as much about judges as we do about, for example, jurors. However, let's take a look at this quote. This is a quote by Judge Peckham in 1985, and what he says is that impartiality is a capacity of mind, a learned ability to recognize and compartmentalize the relevant from the irrelevant, and to detach one's emotions from one's rational facilities. Only because we trust judges to be able to satisfy these obligations do we permit them to exercise power and oversight. Now, interesting. Judge Peckham is suggesting that judges are able to do something that we know that mock jurors or jurors are not able to do, which is, or have a difficult time doing, which is compartmentalize the relevant from the irrelevant and to detach one's emotions from one's rational facilities. And Judge Peckham suggests that judges are able to do this, and because of this, we trust them to satisfy their obligations. Well, what do we know about judges' ability to do these kinds of things? Like I said, we have lots and lots of studies on other players in the judicial system, and we'll be talking about them as class moves on. But the question is whether or not judges, in fact, are different from, I guess, other people. So what I want to do today is to share with you a couple of studies that we have that look at judges and their abilities to compartmentalize the relevant from irrelevant and so forth and so on. And then what I'm going to do at the end of the video, there are several links to short films that sort of highlight some of the big issues in our criminal justice system at this point. Now, those links, I'm going to go ahead and record them as part of this lecture, but for those of you that would prefer to watch these short videos on your own, at your own time, if you go to your slides, you'll see that all the links there are live links. And so you can go ahead and click on them and look at some of the information yourself. So let's get started. First of all, this was a study that was done about judges' ability to be impartial, and it was published in 2001. Now, one of the things that you know that you may have heard about is that sometimes at trial, something comes up at trial and one of the attorneys objects, typically the defense attorney. They say, "I object, I want this thrown out." And the judge then rules sometimes that, yes, in fact, this is inadmissible, and then cautions the jury, says, this information is inadmissible, you're not to consider this further. So what you're basically telling people to do is to hear some information and then to completely block it from their mind. What we have found is that mock jurors have a very difficult time blocking out inadmissible information, and in fact it typically bleeds into their decisions. In other words, some of the things that they decide really get affected by the inadmissible evidence. So let's see whether judges are better than mock jurors or jurors at being able to disregard inadmissible evidence. In this study, there were 88 judges and 104 jurors, and they evaluated a product liability case. So we have a civil case here. In this case, the plaintiff had severe burns on him because a gas container exploded, the contents exploded, and the plaintiff said that the container had no flame arrestor, so the can exploded and leaving him with severe burns. So in this case, then, he's asking for some compensation. Now, in this case, there is some biasing information. Some information comes up during this case, and there's an objection, and it's ruled inadmissible. Here's the biasing information. The biasing information is that manufacturers had issued a warning about possible flame flashbacks from these gas containers. So in other words, they had tried to warn people to be careful about flame flashbacks. But this was ruled inadmissible, and so you're not allowed to let that information cloud your judgment or affect your judgment. So in this particular study, they looked to see whether judges' decisions would be different from jurors and whether or not they in fact let that information bleed into them. It turns out that in this study, judges were no better than jurors at ignoring inadmissible evidence. In other words, they were just as likely to let it affect their decision as jurors, suggesting that they weren't able to separate relevant from irrelevant. Interestingly enough, however, they asked both groups, who do you think is going to be better at ignoring inadmissible evidence? It's going to be judges or jurors? And both groups agreed that judges would be better able to disregard the inadmissible evidence, when in fact, clearly, the judges were no better than the jurors. Here's another study looking at judges' awareness of their own decision-making. This was a study that looked at decisions from 400 sentencing hearings, and these are actual sentencing hearings. So this is where a judge determines the sentence that the defendant should receive. The defendant has already been found guilty. Typically, judges will receive a file with the offender's personal history, their prior convictions, as well as the report by the probation officer, what the probation officer is suggesting. What kind of sentence does the officer suggest? During trial or during the sentencing hearing, the judge hears sentencing recommendations from the defense, the prosecutor, and listens to the offender make a brief statement on his or her own behalf. And so what in this study they did was they asked the judges, after they made their sentencing decision, to describe their decision-making process. In other words, what kinds of things did you think about in order to decide what the best sentence would be for this person? And what they found was that judges gave these really lengthy reports about how they weighed things in making their decisions. They talked about how they considered family situation, whether there was drug or alcohol addiction. In other words, they described a very, very complex decision-making process in which they weighed all kinds of variables. However, their description of their decision-making kind of contradicted the data. Because in fact, judges actually accepted the recommendations by probation officers 84% of the time. In other words, whatever the probation officer said, the judges accepted 84% of the time. And when you looked at what the probation officers used to make their decisions, they typically only used 3 variables: how severe the crime was, whether the person had a prior criminal record, and what we call jail to bail status. Jail to bail status is kind of a pretty big deal at this point, and you're going to see a little video here at the end. That is whether or not the person was able to obtain bail between the time of their arrest to the time of their trial, or whether or not they remained in jail. Okay, so if you remained in jail, that's considered like more damaging to you. So basically, what this study found was that probation officers use very simple algorithms to make decisions. Judges describe very complex algorithms to make their decisions. But in fact, judges are really accepting the probation officers' decisions 84% of the time. So I guess just based on these 2 studies and some others, there's some data to suggest that judges are biased, much like jurors are biased. But the fact of the matter is that there are checks in place to rein in juror bias, but there is nothing in place to really rein in judicial bias. Okay, taking a slightly different turn here, let's talk about some of the crises in the criminal justice system at this point in time. Again, these are 5 short videos. I will be playing them all the way through. For those of you that would prefer, actually one of them is not a video. So hold on with me for just a few minutes. Watch the first one and follow me through the second one, and you can decide whether or not to watch the 3rd and 4th on your own. Okay? This is a video that talks about the issue of corruption in the United States.
Your body was made for better things.
A recent watchdog report estimated that almost half of all Americans think the U.S. justice system is corrupt. It is also approximated that over 2.5 million individual bribes are paid within the judicial system each year. So what's going on? Why are America's judges so corrupt? In In the early 2000s, 2 Pennsylvania judges sent thousands of children to a juvenile detention center in exchange for financial kickbacks from detention center operators. This Kids for Cash scandal resulted in long prison sentences for the guilty parties and raised the issue of judicial corruption. Judges occupy a particularly privileged status within the judicial branch. Although federal judges and Supreme Court justices have lifelong terms, in many states, judges must still run for re-election. While elections are supposed to hold local judges accountable to their constituents, it can often create conflicts of interest, just as it does with politicians. One 2004 case, an Illinois judge won an appointment to the High Court, partially thanks to financial support from a large insurance agency. Suspiciously, the judge later voted to overturn a $1 billion lawsuit against that agency, leading to a federal investigation of the circumstances. As judges are usually unopposed in their rulings, they hold the power to make dishonest judgments for financial gain, as in the Kids for Cash scandal. In a 2013 case, a Texas state judge was convicted of receiving more than $250,000 in bribes and kickbacks in exchange for favorable rulings. Some judgments were even sold for as little as $300 apiece. Judges with tenure and lifelong terms also pose a problem because they are essentially incontrovertible. Alabama Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore has more than once defied popular higher court rulings because of his own religious bias. Most recently, he ordered state officials to refuse marriage licenses to gay couples. Few penalties have been levied against Moore for his actions, though. In 2015, the Southern Poverty Law Center officially filed an ethical complaint. The American judicial system plays one of the most important regulatory roles in society. While an overwhelming majority of judges play by the rules, the lack of oversight and accountability leaves the door wide open for corruption. Although a few government organizations like the Public Integrity Section study public officials, the investigation and prosecution of judges is a highly sensitive issue. Watchdog groups and media reports indicate that corruption is clearly present within the judicial system, but prosecution is difficult when those in question are the ones interpreting the law. While corrupt judges can fortunately be voted out if they are local, Supreme Court judges are here to stay for life, whether we love them or hate them. To find out why, watch our video here.
What's the logic behind lifetime appointments? Well, the framers wanted judges to be as nonpartisan as possible by removing their need to run for re-election on various political platforms every few years. Federal judges are expected to be impartial in their court decisions in order to uphold the law.
Thanks for watching Test Tube News today. Please remember to like and subscribe.
Okay. As you might guess, corruption is probably less of an issue in the United States than it is in some other countries, but certainly we're not immune to it. Okay. The video that you just saw suggests another problem. It talked about Robert Moore, and that's not so much an issue of corruption, but rather a refusal to follow the law. What we've been seeing is when Supreme Court cases get handed down, sometimes there's some social issues that are involved here, and there are justices that refuse to follow the law. Judge Moore is one of them. But we, in Wyoming, have a justice who is currently up on ethics complaints for the same reason. This is Justice Neely. She is probably going to be removed from the bench because she won't perform same-sex marriages. She says it violates her religious beliefs, and that may well be the case, and it may be something that's closely held by her. But the fact is that she's a judge, and that she's bound to follow the law. And since the law says that same-sex weddings are legal, she is supposed to actually perform them. The fact that she refuses to means that she's actually refusing to follow the law. She may think that she's following her own moral compass, but in fact, she's breaking her ethical code of conduct, and she is being suspended. It looks like she has been suspended from her position as magistrate. So again, this is something that is an issue in this country. Here's another issue that has been kind of front and center in our criminal justice system during the past couple of years. And it's something that's getting enough attention that maybe we will be doing something about. But let's take a look at this video.
There are tremendous racial disparities in our criminal justice system. The statistics are really startling. In 1954, there were about 100,000 African American men in America's prisons and jails, and today there are almost 900,000. Today, 1 in 3 African American men can expect to go to prison sometime in his lifetime. 1 in 6 Latino males as compared to 1 in 17 white males. So the statistics are stark. And there are many causes for the racial disparities in our criminal justice system. They are myriad and complex. Yes, there is some disproportionate offending for certain types of crimes, but there's also a lot of discretionary decision-making by actors, criminal justice officials in our system, from arrest all the way through sentencing, by police officers, prosecutors, judges, and others. Discretionary decisions that produce racial results, from racial profiling on the part of police officers to charging and plea bargaining decisions by prosecutors to decisions by judges. I don't think that most of these decisions involve intentional discrimination, but oftentimes they involve implicit bias, unconscious biases that individuals have, that we all have in society, that officials in our criminal justice system have. And unfortunately, when they're making decisions about criminal justice issues based on those unconscious biases they aren't even aware of, it can have devastating results and produce the kind of racial disparities that I just talked about. There are also a lot of race-neutral factors that prosecutors in particular take into account that can have racial results in our criminal justice system. And I think the key is to sort of figure out through evidence-based studies, what are the decisions that prosecutors are making that are having these unintended racial consequences? Because once we figure out what those are, then prosecutors can use their power and discretion in ways to hopefully eliminate those disparities, or at least to drastically reduce them. I think prosecutors are uniquely situated to fix this problem. And the reason is because prosecutors are the most powerful officials in our criminal justice system, bar none. I think they're more powerful than judges because they make the charging decision and they make the plea bargaining decision. And those decisions are the decisions that really drive our criminal justice system. Yes, police officers have a tremendous amount of power and discretion on the street because they're the individuals who usually have the first contact with individuals when they make a decision about whether to stop a person, whether to arrest a person. But they can only take the person as far as the courthouse door. It's the prosecutor who makes the decision about whether that person should be charged and firmly entrenched in the system. And that charging decision combined with the decision of whether or not to offer a plea bargain, especially in a system where we have so many crimes that have mandatory minimum sentences, those decisions really almost predetermine the outcome in cases.
So there you have one sort of a description of some of the issues in terms of the criminal justice system. I want to end by just talking about some racial disparities in another part of our system, which is the bail system. As I mentioned previously, the jail to bail status is a big deal. Whether or not you're given bail and are able to post bail really predicts whether or not your sentence actually, in terms of whether or not you're going to get a long sentence or a short sentence. However, it turns out that bail itself, there are racial disparities in the bail system as well. So let's take a quick look.
The bottom line is that in too many places, black boys and black men, Latino boys and Latino men, experience being treated differently under the law. A growing body of research shows that people of color are more likely to be stopped, frisked, questioned, charged, detained.
The fact is, we have a lot of conversation about police encounters, but hardly any conversation about the role of prosecutors and criminal court judges in a pretrial setting. It's about time we have that conversation.
Issues of bail have been largely on the sidelines. Bail reform is a civil rights issue. Bail reform is a human rights issue. Bail reform is a national crisis that's hidden in plain sight.
purpose of bail was to give an individual who's been arrested and accused, but who's presumed innocent, a way to get out of jail. And so the idea originally was, if we make you pay some money, you'll have an incentive to come back to court, and you won't want to reoffend or get into any trouble because you're going to lose that money. Instead of it being that, it has morphed into this industry where we have commercial bail bondsmen, and the amount of money that individuals are required to pay in order to get out of jail has just become extremely high.
We think that bail is the great interrupter when it comes to resolving criminal matters, and it has a very negative impact on all individuals, but particularly people of color.
Combine together the higher bail amounts and the greater likelihood that African American and Latino defendants are more likely to have to pay bail to be released, they're at a much greater disadvantage compared to whites.
Okay, if everybody would kindly stand up and raise your right hand, and so I can swear everybody in.
The problem is that pretrial detention really sets the ball rolling. It's sort of like a scarlet letter. Being poor, being African American, being Latino, that stigma carries over so that people who have been detained pretrial are presumed to be more guilty or riskier people because they were in jail. It rubs off at sentencing.
There are lots of alternatives to jurisdictions and courts and jails to holding a human being in a cage because she can't make a payment.
I wanted to sell some narcotics to support my habit. I was out there no more than 15 minutes before I got busted. And I found myself sitting down there in Central Cell Block saying, God, please help me. I was thoroughly convinced that this was it. Pretrial gave me a chance.
Services Agency does a risk assessment. We interview the defendant in cell block. We look at his criminal history or her criminal history. We look at whether there's a pending case. We look at whether they're on probation or parole, whether there are any warrants outstanding. We look at their drug and mental health history. We administer a drug test. And we kind of put together a summary report that goes to the court with our recommendation. We really look at the people that are low risk. We recommend that they be released with no conditions. And we look at the people that are of more medium or higher risk and then recommend commensurate release conditions to the court that we think will assist them in coming back to court and in keeping from being rearrested.
It's a great feeling. You know, it gets me teary-eyed to actually talk about this at times, though, because it's just a great feeling knowing that I'm on my way. I was given a second chance.
The reason why we have to focus on pretrial detention is because there's a clear benefit to society by focusing on this issue, by having people being able to continue their lives, continue their jobs, continue being family members, continue being parents. I mean, we're supposed to be operating on a constitution that says, you know, you are innocent until proven guilty. We're losing people who, at the end of the day, may come out and may even come out not guilty. But we're losing too many people in a temporary holding pattern, which makes no sense. Society has to do a lot better than this.
There you go. So there are some of the issues that we're going to be talking about in this class in different ways. Next time we're going to switch gears and move from the sort of judiciary and the criminal justice system to some of the other legal players in our system. See you next time. Thank you.